So today I'd like to speak to you a little bit about why I think that when it comes to the evidence revolution, we're leaving people out and why that's a problem, I think, and a substantial one, in fact. So this is the first slide in pretty much any talk that I give. Really, it's a visual that puts across that fundamentally, when we think about threats to biodiversity, all of those at their genesis are about people. People as individuals, people as groups, people as institutions, as governments, as countries. And if we believe that that's the case, then that's where we need to be acting. In fact, if we look at the red list and we think about what processes threaten species, 98% of the species classified as threatened in the red list are threatened only by processes that have at their genesis human behavior, human action, right? So clearly, the biggest, by far the biggest thing we need to be worrying about. So I don't think it's a very big leap to state that biodiversity conservation is an exercise in human persuasion at its core. Now, several years ago, I was really interested in understanding what was out there published when it came to influencing human behavior for the benefit of the environment. So together with colleagues, and I'd like to particularly acknowledge Laura Thomas Walters, who led this work, we did something that wasn't very wise in retrospect, which was we set out to do this incredibly broad review of published work on any area of environmental sustainability around behavior change interventions. We looked for interventions that measured actual behavior, so not attitudes, not knowledge, not awareness, actual behavior. We looked for interventions that had a defensible, counterfactual, didn't need to be randomized, but you had to be able to defend it somehow. And when it came to the end, we found 128 interventions. And you might think, well, 128, probably not the number we wished for. It's not that bad. It's 3 digits, isn't it? Yes, but remember that I said that this was across environmental sustainability, right? So we included water conservation, energy conservation, waste management. And those are things that, of course, really important and relate to environmental sustainability, but they're not, at least what I think when I think about wildlife conservation, biodiversity conservation, I don't think necessarily about those topics. When I boiled it down and we thought about biodiversity conservation more like in the strictest sense, we got 5 interventions. So not a huge number, not great, but we thought to ourselves, well, this was a really broad review. Maybe the keywords were just too broad. We didn't have a strong enough strategy maybe to capture the great literature. It's so important in conservation. We also only focused on English language literature, so it's a big caveat as well, as I think has already been highlighted. So maybe that's where the problem lies. We need to be a bit more specific. So together with colleague Anita Wan, we did this review focusing on demand reduction interventions, behavioral interventions to reduce demand for wildlife products that relate to certain species or unsustainable trade. And in that case, we try to fulfill some of these gaps. We had a much more explicit, much more robust strategy to tackle gray literature. We also had searches in Chinese, because of course China is a very important player when it comes to this topic in the literature. And so we looked at this. We found just under 300 interventions. Not so bad. 25% of those reported some information on outcomes. I think the catch, though, is that those 25% are just the ones that are reporting any information at all at any standard, right? Now, once you boil it again to those interventions that have, for example, experimental design that allows you to say something about causality, very much to Bill's presentation initially, what does that number look like? 3. So not great again, right? But maybe it's because, maybe we need to be way more specific about this. Maybe we need to really focus on something that's a little bit more specific, to something that's a bit more of a, maybe has more humph behind it. And so together, again, with colleagues, this was led by Alegría Olmedo. was involved in a review looking at the use of celebrity endorsements in environmental campaigns. This is a very widely used sort of technique by different organizations in the environmental sector. So what did that look like? Well, just under 80 interventions that were listed. 4 of those had an evaluation. How many of those looked at the actual role of the celebrity endorsement? None. Right, so this is a pattern. You can see where I'm going with this, right? I'll do one more, just, so slightly changing tact. We thought, well, maybe if we pick something that's more academically, it's a more sort of academically friendly sort of thing to write about, maybe we'll be more successful. We'll find something that's has more substance, right? In this case, we picked framing. So framings, Mark just talked about framings, one of those very well discussed sort of, cognitive biases. And it talks about this idea that depending on how you present the same information, you can get people to react differently, right? It might be a small tweak in the way that you present the information, but you get a different outcome, a different reaction from the person that's exposed to that information, right? So in this case, and fingers crossed because it's still in review, and shout out to Elena Rubin, who's been very, very helpful in moving this work forward. What we found was a little bit different. So there was, my intuition was a little bit right. So we found 45 interventions that had, that were defensible, that had a defensible counterfactual to them. But even then, when it came to risk of bias assessment, and we looked at the ones that had low risk of bias, so the ones that we could really be confident about, we only had 12. And so, I mean, 12 is better than the other cases I reported before. But still, we're talking about one of the things that has the most, that is one of the cognitive biases that most widely discussed. We have papers already making recommendations about how to use framing, for example, right? And the evidence base behind it, it's still not, I think, at least what I would expect it to be for something that we talk about so much and for something that we refer to as one key tool that we have to try to influence people, right? So there's clearly, I think, some limitations. Now, I hear you thinking very loudly for me to stop my doom mongering, which I will now. What do we do? So there's this gap we've detected. So what now? What's the way forward here? And I'm gonna put forward three things that I think are important. So the first one is this idea that very, very often when we think about conservation, we still think really, we just focus on the ecological side of things. We don't really we say social science, but we don't treat it as if it's actual science. So if I tell you about boxes for nesting birds, if I talk to you about logs for beetles, if I talk to you about flowers for butterflies, that conjures discussion around experimental designs and replicates and power analyses and all these types of things. But if I talk to you about communication, advocacy, education, all of a sudden we move into the sort of vibes-based rule where we don't really need evidence for that. That's sort of okay. We do that. We recognize it's important, but it's sort of okay. And so I think that's a really important realization, is this idea that, yeah, people are species too, and they happen to be, without arguing, the most important species if you want to conserve the other ones. So my next point is really about broadening our toolbox and thinking about the causal revolution that Julia talked to. And this idea that if we really want to take it mainstream, if we really want to get it out there everywhere, we'll need to go beyond the quantitative techniques that have taken us so far and that served us so well and continue to serve us so well. But we'll need to go beyond that and use methods that are qualitative in nature, that are actually better in some instances in answering questions like some of the ones that were mentioned earlier on, when you have really for example, political changes, policy changes where you have really complex scenarios with multiple actors, multiple interventions in the same environment. for example, that's a really good case where these techniques could give us a lot of information. And it could also allow a wider range of people to engage in these types of practices, ones that might not have, the quantitative training that, for example, some of the quasi-experimental designs and even RCTs really would require, right? When you say we talk about a power analysis, that's such an important thing to consider, but it's also not something that a lot of practitioners will be able to engage with directly. And so I think this move to a broader, wider use of these techniques is really key. And then the last thing is this idea of being better at facilitating learning across conservation as a field. So, of course, we desperately need to talk about our successes because it's tough. It's tough doing this sort of work. Certainly, I think we don't get as many wins as we wish we did, particularly in the current, context. But it's also true that we're not particularly good at sharing the things, sharing the knowledge that we have. A colleague in one of the workshops was saying, well, I actually think my organization does more testing on the communication side than on the ecological side. And I think that's actually true for many organizations, but the key thing is that knowledge is then, there's no avenue, there's no pathway for that to be then shared with other organizations, with the public, with other people, academics, researchers. And so that information is then lost. All that testing that maybe your marketing team does or your comms team does, then we don't have access to that. And so that's really a challenge. And of course, there are other challenges. And I was really, really excited to, now more than 10 years ago, which is a little troubling as I come to realize it, to do a special issue for conservation evidence on behavior change interventions. And of course, if you look back now, what percentage of conservation evidence or articles published in conservation evidence is about human behavior? I mean, I've not done this study, but I bet it's less than 5% of what's published there. Right? And so we do need to get better at publishing even the simple tests that we do. When I say publish, I don't necessarily mean it in an academic sense. I mean more in making it available and discoverable. That's really what I'm trying to get at. And so, again, really a privilege to talk to you all today. I think if you get nothing else from this talk, I think human behavior is really the key thing we need to be thinking about when we think about conserving species. If we want to get better at being more effective, I think we need to, on one hand, get better at using a wide array of evidence, namely qualitative evidence. We need to get better at sharing the work that we are doing. And I think we need to, as a field, just continue to embrace, I think, the evidence revolution that Bill so kindly has been pushing forward all this time. Thank you very much.